Americans believe a lot of myths, and it pains me that the myth we're talking about today, which is the myth of the free press, is actually one of the most precious concepts to exist in any society, and it is absolutely the cornerstone of a free and civil, small r, Republican society, for a free press in principle helps correct the abuses and excesses of power, and additionally, it disseminates information to the masses in a manner that allows them to achieve enlightenment and ultimately reach virtue. But in reality, my friends, the free press is as old writers would call it, a chimera, a myth that gives us comfort, but ultimately fades away upon great scrutiny. And the fact that NPR, National Public Radio, exists demonstrates to us how much of a myth this concept is. And it also tells all of us who are Americans and who love America, who love the philosophy of America, that we must call, without equivocation, for the immediate and utter defunding of NPR to reclaim and restore what our country should be. Indeed, my friends, the idea that NPR can exist within a context of the free press is actually rather laughable. And I'll explain why it's laughable in a moment. But first, let's talk about why I'm talking about NPR in particular, since I can talk about anything else. NPR has been in the news recently. So one of their longtime editors has alleged political bias. Now, this has caused a firestorm. A lot of conservative influencers have been coming out and saying that NPR should be defunded because it has a left-wing bias and things of that sort. And while I certainly have been speaking out against NPR for years, in fact, I have a video called The Case for Defunding NPR where I call for it to be defunded, not because it has political viewpoints I disagree with, but because in principle, NPR shouldn't really exist in its current form in the first place. And a lot of people are missing the fact that NPR, its very existence, is not an affront to America. Just because they hold terrible opinions, it's an affront to America because it rejects everything our country stands for in a relationship between the press, the public, and the government. In order to actually understand why NPR is so vile and how it runs athwart the principle of the free press, we have to go to its original inceptions. NPR was birthed into America not even 100 years ago. In fact, there are some of you that were born or who were little kids who are watching me that were around when NPR was created. NPR was created with the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 by that great totalitarian and tyrant and anti-American radical, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And when he signed the act on November 7th, 1967, he described the purposes of this act as the follows, from the horse's mouth itself. I quote, "It announces to the world, this bill, that our nation wants more than material wealth. Our nation wants more than a chicken in every pot. We in America have an appetite for excellence. 2, while we work every day to produce new goods and to create new wealth, we want most of all to enrich man's spirit." That is the purpose of this act. Let me read that again for those of you who didn't catch that. We want most of all to enrich man's spirit. That is the purpose of this act. The Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which brought rise to both PBS and NPR. Now, NPR will claim, they will shout to the heavens, that only 1% of our funding actually comes from the government. Well, that's not true, because the Corporation for Public Broadcasting actually funnels grants through certain organizations that makes up the bulk of NPR's funding. So make no mistake, whether it's directly or indirectly, NPR is a state-funded entity. Now, the reason why NPR should be objected to is primarily because the grounds upon which it conceived are fundamentally anti-American and opposed to how information should be disseminated in a free society. The government does not have the moral legitimacy or license to enrich our spirits, because to enrich a man's spirit, that implies a certain level of intervention in society that goes outside of the bounds of what government was originally constituted to actually pursue in its proper form. Well, the problem is, government has gone beyond its proper form and has become this sort of a la carte, universal thing that people that have different political persuasions and different desires can use to achieve and chase their own ends, as opposed to chasing what they should be chasing, and that is the principles upon which political order is legitimated. But in fact, this sort of rise of progressivism, which is embodied in this notion that it should be the government, the community, the collective that enriches your spirit, and not the church, not the society, not your community itself in their own capacity, is fundamentally anti-American, and it's fundamentally also paradoxical. How in the world can government, which is a law-making agency, it makes rules and it enforces rules by the barrel of a gun, how can government enrich anything? Because government's primary object of interacting with all of us is force, their ability to compel. Compulsion enriches nothing and destroys everything. And some things need to be destroyed. Some people who seek to do theft against you or kill you or do all kind of things to you and kidnap you, they need to be destroyed. And that's why force is a legitimate tool in those hands. But beyond that, there is no role for governmental involvement and personal enrichment. That just can't happen because creativity takes place on the ground level, not from centralized planners living in some white marble building that they take your money to fund. So NPR is built on a false premise, and it also was built on a rejection of the freedom of the press. So let's actually explain here what the freedom of the press is and why it is important conceptually, but why it also has not been lived out in American society. The freedom of the press is this notion that you should be able to print, broadcast, and speak in a manner that disseminates information without undue interference, impediment, or getting the imprimatur of the government. Now, in the old world before America was founded, the press was almost entirely controlled by the forces of power. What the truth was actually a matter of what those in power allowed to be printed. And this is why John Milton, in his brilliant speech, Areopagitica, which all of you should go read, made this point. He said, how can I be a creative soul? How can I be a virtuous soul if everything that I want to say has to be approved by someone who has the ability to quash my creativity and quash my virtue and filter my words basically through the lens they want them to be filtered through? It's a virtual impossibility for society to progress and to grow and to flourish in a manner that is good under those conditions. And so the freedom of the press is not just important in terms of the growth of society. The freedom of the press is especially important and unique for the self-governance of a free society, a civil society. Because the self-governance process itself actually implies that people who are self-governing, people who are consenting to give their permission for the government to exist, have the information that they actually need to make the best decisions for how their government is ran. In the absence of a free press, in the absence of a social, private check on authority, in the absence of the ability to express yourself in a manner that does not require permission from authority, you can't have a enriched self-governing process. Your self-governing process will be governed by the information that those in authority wish for you to have, and therefore it will always be misled, it will always be distorted, and you will not be able to actually engage in self-governance. You will be instead a simple puppet in this long game controlled by some forces outside of you, which then therefore means you are not living in a free society, you are living in a dictatorship. So the philosophical necessity of a free press to a society that calls itself free is absolutely indispensable. Now, in American constitutional history, the free press has normally three pillars. Number one, the government may not license you because a license suggests permission for something. Number two, the government may not differentially tax the press. And number three, the government may not restrict what the press may say. Now, every single pillar of what freedom of press means in America has been violated and continues to be violated to this day. Number one, the government absolutely does provide licensing for major broadcast media in the form of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and they also censor what happens in that media as well. They can censor you if you do, for example, have a certain kinds of commercial advertising they don't like. They can censor you if you do certain kinds of obscenity they don't like. There was a big thing in the 90s where there were rappers or there were people doing obscenity. They got arrested for it. They can censor you for so many different things. And also, they absolutely tax the press as well. So the pillars of the freedom of the press in America have been violated, and they continue to be violated. And NPR is simply another example of that. Because if the press is supposed to be uninhibited and uninfluenced by government influence, how can that happen when they are quite literally being given money by the government to do their dirty work? Most importantly, how can they be an impartial voice? How can they be a voice of truth when this is happening? Now, even in the case of corporations that do not have direct influence from government, there's another question that actually is posed by our consideration of this issue. Many broadcast old world media corporations, CNN, CBS, all these places, ABC, the way they consider sources that are credible or non-credible does so in a way that lends the government a lot of credence. For example, the Pentagon literally dispatched an entire team of propagandists to influence the American public's perspectives during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in a manner that painted them as these impartial military analysts, when in our reality, they were on the Pentagon's payroll and they were being paid secretly to advance the agenda of the American war effort to the detriment of perspectives that were against it. So these so-called impartial arbiters of information, these analysts, were given free rein by the broadcast corporate media to spew as much propaganda as they wanted with no corrective, which unfortunately tainted the minds of many Americans with nonsensical propositions that they were given no other choice but to believe in that particular cable news context. Even if the government didn't give a cent to CNN, or a cent to ABC, or a cent to NBC, the fact that media considers government sources to be credible without checking the merits of what they say, that single fact shows we don't have a free press. Because a free press is not simply something that is uninhibited by licensing or government. A free press is an energetic and intellectually curious organ of the society which defends people from intellectual malpractice from their government and from government actors that may seek to manipulate them. But when you have a perverse revolving door between the White House and the media, when you have a perverse revolving door between the Defense Department and the media, how in the world can you expect to have a press that is truly free? So whether it is informally not free through this revolving door, or whether it is formally not free through licensing, through taxes, through censorship, regardless of what it is, the free press is an enduring myth in our republic. We need to have a separation, my friends, between media and state. So many people talk about the separation of church and state, but few of us talk about the separation between media and state. Because the media speaks to the masses. The state speaks to those in power. And in order for the state to be effective, it must have some influence over the masses. And the norms of power, if we know anything about them, the norms of power will always be used in a manner that seeks to preserve power, even at the detriment of morality. And that, my friends, is one of the reasons why we need to have this separation between media and state. Americans should demand it. And I think that this is actually happening organically through the sort of dissolution of the centralized old world media and the springing up in the generation of independent content creators like me and others who are doing their best to get information to you. We may not do it in an unbiased way, because I have a bias, obviously. I'm biased towards the small r, classically Republican principles of America. I'm biased towards my nation. I love my country. But I'm also biased towards truth. But I will give you information in a way that is honest, even if I don't agree with some implications of how that information can be taken by some wayward minds who may not accept my premises. My friends, a free press is 100% essential to a flourishing society. Because a free press presumes there will be a moral context in which you can express yourself without inhibition. So a free press, by consequence, is a result of free minds. And free minds are a result of freedom of expression. And freedom of expression is a result of that faculty which allows man to make sense of everything he knows, make sense of his society, make sense of his family, make sense of his life, make sense of morality, make sense of reality, everything he knows. It enables him to make sense of that, interact with it, and to drink from the well springs that come from being able to attune yourself to what is true. But the moment that wellspring is tainted by the desires of power, as it has been with the existence of NPR, the existence of PBS, and the mythical nature of the free press, as it is so called, is the moment, my friends, we cease to have full and healthy free expression in this country. And if we have a terrible culture of free expression, we will also have an equally horrifying culture of power that takes advantage of that weakness to its own benefits. Now, let me just be honest here. The press, there's a myth I want to combat. The press has never been this sort of objective, Walter Cronkite-esque institution that so many people, so many boomers think that it's been. No assault to the boomers, by the way. I love boomers. I love you guys so much. But a lot of you think that the press became opinion overnight. No. In fact, Thomas Jefferson made a very important point in his day in the 1780s. Thomas Jefferson lamented the state of the press. He said that the press had abandoned prostitution to falsehood. He also said that nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle. John Ward Finno, who was a journalist in 1799, he said that the American newspapers are the most base, false, servile, venal publications that ever polluted the fountains of society. So the point is this: for a good majority of American history, the press has been an enemy of truth. But conceptually, and in some cases empirically, the press has also been a vehicle for certain truths to be revealed. Watergate, for example, was a truth revealed by Bob Woodward and Bernstein, even though both of them themselves are establishment hacks that in this current era don't do much useful, but back then they did. The Pentagon Papers, for example, revealed the lies of the Vietnam War that had been crammed down the throats of Americans, not in a good way, by the way, but in a bad way. And by doing that, we now know that Vietnam was built on false premises, which can then inform the public on how it will treat future wars and how, most importantly, they will conduct their trust in the government. There have been so many instances of the press itself being a vehicle for truth. But the exceptions, my friends, are not the rule. And we've seen in so many cases, whether it be with COINTELPRO or other things, that the press has oftentimes been an instrument and a unequivocal, unapologetic ally of those in authority. You don't have a free press in that case. We haven't had a free press in a very long time. And if we want to really, really get back to a tradition where we can actually have a free press, we need to embrace decentralization of press and information, and most importantly, we need to abolish the Public Broadcasting Corporation. We need to abolish broadcast licenses, and most importantly, we need to defund NPR, PBS, and assign the legacy of that great totalitarian, Lyndon Baines Johnson, to the dustbin of history, where it will only be talked about and discussed, and never with a heart of reminiscence and nostalgia. My friends, if you enjoyed this video, if you want to help me continue to produce philosophical commentary on political and social issues, please do a few things for me right now. Share this video with your friends. Comment on this video. Like this video. And donate to me if you wish. All that information will be in the comment section down below. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.